Bonjour. Bonjour and bienvenue. The Honourable Josh Frydenberg MP, Australian Minister for Environment and Energy, Dr Fatih Birol, Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, Mr Finn Pratt, the Secretary of the Australian Department of Environment and Energy, ambassadors, distinguished guests and friends all. I'm Brian Pontifex, Australian Ambassador to the OECD, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Australian Embassy in France for another stimulating session of the IEA's Big Ideas Speakers Series. Welcome to those watching across the globe via the live streaming service as well. This Speakers Series was launched in late 2015, just prior to COP21 in Paris, with the first address by Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland and UN Secretary-General's Climate Change Envoy. Since then, a number of ministers and former ministers, business and community leaders have shared their insights about the energy sector, including some of the big challenges, trends and innovations. As the IEA points out in its respected annual World Energy Outlook, global energy needs will expand by 30% between today and 2040, which is the equivalent of adding another China and India to today's global energy demand. These are staggering projections, informed by the growth in the world's population from 7.4 billion today to more than 9 billion in 20 years' time, and the process of urbanisation, which will add a city the size of Shanghai, about 24 million, to the world's urban population every 4 months. Today, I'm particularly delighted that we have the opportunity to hear about Australia and Australian insights on the energy transition. I'm even more proud and honoured that today's speaker series features Minister Frydenberg, someone that I've known, respected and worked with over the years, in fact stretching back to the turn of the century, which sounds like a long period of time, and it probably is, but mercifully we've both maintained our youthful appearance, fitness and vibrancy. Speaking of youthful, fit and vibrant, it's now my pleasant task to introduce Dr Fatih Birol, who was appointed IEA Executive Director nearly 3 years ago. And in that short space of time, he has succeeded in broadening the global reach of the IEA, and he's done so with relentless vigour, drive and determination. Importantly, with the full backing and endorsement of energy ministers from all IEA member countries. A person of considerable talent, Fatih has a degree in power engineering, a master's and PhD in energy economics from Vienna, served as the chief economist for the IEA for many years, and has been named by Forbes magazine as among the most influential people on the world energy scene. And if that wasn't enough, he was recently named the Financial Times Energy Personality of the Year. Despite all those achievements, though, I suspect that one of the most satisfying days of his existence on this planet was when he was made an honorary life member of his beloved Galatasaray football club in Istanbul. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to invite Dr Birol to formally introduce Minister Frydenberg. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors, dear colleagues, welcome to IEA's Big Ideas Distinguished Speaker Series, and many thanks to Ambassador Pontifex for hosting us here and also giving us an overview of this very series, which is, I guess, successfully run in the last 2 years, I guess, Rebecca. No, almost 2 years we are doing it, and my colleague, Mrs. Gagan, is in charge of running this program. It is my great honor. It's a great honor to today host Minister Josh Frydenberg. I know Mr. Frydenberg since 2015, not as, we don't have a long history as Mr. Ambassador, but he's a very energetic minister. And he just arrived an hour ago from Australia through Dubai. And before coming here, I arrived 1 hour ago to this very building upstairs, but in the meantime, he made a run around to Champ de Mars, and he came here to discuss with you energy and climate change matters. There are several people who I would like to have their jobs. Josh, for example, Neymar, you know Neymar. This is I don't have big chances to have it, at least now. It's already over. But your job is the one that I would never like to have. Especially that you are in your very beloved country, Australia. I know how difficult it is to say anything, even to think maybe on energy and climate. So this is a very difficult job. But I know that Mr. Minister works very, very hard to put two things together. The energy security of the country, which is very important. At the same time, pushing the climate change agenda very strongly to bring two very perhaps different objectives together and find a compromise within the society with different stakeholders. And I know that this is a very, very difficult job, Josh. And I really appreciate all of your efforts, including the recent one, a very creative one, the National Energy Guarantee. On one hand, your concept tried to bring the electricity prices down or keep them under control. Electricity security has an important emphasis and priority, but also this will also lead to reduction of emissions in the Australian energy sector. Australia, in general, has been very, very supportive of the IEA efforts. As Mr. Ambassador mentioned, since almost 3 years. In fact, I didn't realize it was 3 years. 3 years and several important agenda items we follow, as Mr. Ambassador mentioned, one of them being the opening the doors of the IEA to emerging countries, having China, India, Mexico, Indonesia with the IEA, and I have enjoyed unconditional support of Mr. Minister and also his own government. Australia, I think many of us know, is one of the cornerstones of the global energy system, a major gas producer and LNG exporter, top uranium producer and exporter, a very important coal exporter, and will remain so many years to come, and at top of the agenda in terms of solar PV in the world. And at the same time pushes several important clean energy technologies, including carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We are very fortunate to have you here, Mr. Minister. Among other reasons, we organize this meeting always here when we have the opportunity, and Mr. Ambassador kindly gives us this very nice venue for this Big Ideas series. And it is the first time that we don't pay any money to Mr. Ambassador for renting this place. Thank you very much. And even though you are an Austrian ambassador, I don't take it for granted, but it's very, very kind of you, Ambassador Pontifex, for giving us for free. But in fact, we are very fortunate, ladies and gentlemen, to have Mr. Minister, one of the leading energy and climate ministers in the world, with us today. And please join me, welcome Minister Frydenberg to International Energy Agency. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Fatty Birol. Firstly, Ambassador Pontifex, thank you for your warm hospitality, and to other ambassadors who are here today, my secretary of my department, Mr Finn Pratt, and of course to you, Fatty Birol, who has brought himself a great deal of energy and leadership to his role as the head of the IEA, the preeminent, the dominant energy body in the world, and one that we support you entirely in the expansion of your membership, but also the expansion of the notion of what constitutes energy security and the clean energy hub that you are seeking to develop. That sort of leadership is something that Australia strongly supports. And having had more than 2 decades within the IEA, I know that I speak for everyone in this room. Long may you continue to bring great leadership to that role. As for Neymar, the soccer player, well, Australia lost to France, and that was a great point of sadness in our country. But Neymar is now more known for his less his heroics on the field, but he's acting, he's lunging in front of the umpires, something which is a no-no back in Australia. Look, but we're out anyway. We're out. Although I will be going to a pub tomorrow, I think, to watch France play tomorrow, I'm told. So that should be an exciting thing to do. Look, today I thought I would talk about Australia's perceptions, views on our changing domestic energy market, and maybe some of the lessons that it can provide for other countries around the world. Because as you said, Fatty, we are a global energy powerhouse, soon to overtake Qatar as the world's largest exporter of LNG, large thermal coal exporter and user domestically, the largest known reserves of uranium in the world. And according to our Australian Renewable Energy Agency, the greatest penetration on a per capita basis of solar and wind power across our country. So we are abundant in natural resources, but we haven't necessarily seen that translate into low household and business energy prices. And that's part of this transition that is currently underway in Australia's energy system, what our chief scientist, Dr. Alan Finkel, called the most significant transformation in energy markets in more than a century, since the so-called Battle of the Currents, or the War of the Currents, the AC/DC wars between Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison more than 100 years ago, because our energy market is changing very dramatically. I thought I'd start with an anecdote. As a politician, we tend to look after our constituents and are deeply engaged with them. And the other day I got a phone call from a local business owner in my electorate. He ran an organic supermarket. He employed 34 people. He said to me he works in the business 7 days a week. He gets up at 2:30 in the morning to go to the market to buy the produce. He gets home at 7:30 at night. His wife also works in the business, and he takes home just a little bit more than $70,000 a year. And he was despondent. And he was ringing me because his energy bill had gone from $1,000 a week to $1,400 a week in his business for cold storage and for the other utilities that he uses in his business. And he said, look, I run an organic supermarket, so actually I want the world to be cleaner and better for my children. But what I don't want is to be driven out of business or have such high power bills that I'll be forced to shed staff, which is the only alternative that was available to him. And it brought it into focus for me just how real this energy transition is, what an impact it is having on households and businesses, because Australia has gone from having the 5th lowest power prices in the OECD just over a decade ago to now having the 5th or 6th highest energy prices in the OECD. So it's been a tumultuous decade for us when it comes to energy prices. And it's actually those who are less fortunate in the community, those with lower incomes, who bear a disproportionate burden of those higher power bills. If you're in the bottom 20% of income earners in Australia, you spend 5 times as much of your disposable income on energy than if you're in the top 20% of income earners. So for me, our priority is to deliver affordable power. We have to deliver reliable power, and we also have to stay true to our international commitments at Paris to reduce our emissions. Our commitment is a 26 to 28% reduction by 2030 on our 2005 levels. So today I thought I would talk about 3 separate issues. Firstly, to give you a sense of how our domestic energy market is changing and changing rapidly. Secondly, to touch upon the reforms that we have underway to drive prices down. And thirdly, to come to this National Energy Guarantee, which the Bloomberg Energy Finance has described as elegant, innovative, and perhaps world-leading, and maybe a blueprint for other countries to follow. Firstly, in terms of our energy mix and our energy system. Less than 2 decades ago, in the year 2000, Australia had 3 solar farms and 2 wind farms. Just 0.1% of our generation was coming from intermittent sources of power, namely wind and solar. Wind the clock forward to today, and 90% of investment in the last 5 years in energy generation assets in Australia has been wind and solar. And over that period of time, we've seen 10 coal-fired power stations close in the last decade, significantly changing our energy mix. So we've gone from having predominantly synchronous baseload thermal generation, overwhelmingly coal and a bit of gas, to increasingly having more intermittent sources of generation, particularly wind and solar. The other thing that's changed in Australia is more and more people are less reliant on the grid. Because what we've seen, and Fatty alluded to this, is that Australians are taking up rooftop solar in record numbers. Some 20% of Australian households now have solar panels on their roofs, and in some states like Queensland, it's around 30%. So more than 6 gigawatts of power is now being generated through solar panels on people's roofs. And it's a remarkable transition that has been assisted by generous feed-in tariffs at the state level, but also a small-scale renewable energy target at the federal level. Now, this transition to more solar panels on people's roofs is creating real challenges for our market operator because, as you can understand, the so-called duck curve, where during the day people are less dependent on the grid because they're generating power at home, but come 5:30, 6 o'clock at night and the sun has gone down, and if they don't have battery storage, they then start relying on the grid, and there's questions as to who should pay for the infrastructure to support them, even though they may only be on the grid for a few hours a day. The other big change that is occurring in our energy system is we've gone from having rising demand year on year to increasingly flatlining demand, despite our population growing dramatically and despite our economy growing dramatically. And this is something that Fatty and the IEA are focusing on greatly, which is energy efficiency. The best bill to have is one you don't, or the best bill to have is one where you don't generate additional use of power by becoming more efficient. So we've applied new standards across the built environment for appliances and a whole host of new energy efficient measures both in business and households, which have dramatically reduced our energy usage even though the population is growing. Another significant change has been around gas markets. Historically on the east coast of Australia, we have produced gas for domestic use. But about a decade ago, significant investment was taking place in building a large LNG export sector from the east coast of Australia. We'd had it historically on the west coast of Australia from the northwest shelf, but now it's being built on the east coast of Australia. So 2/3 of what we produce on the east coast of Australia is now exported overseas, mainly to markets in Asia, but also further abroad. The result of that is gas prices are now internationally linked. We have pricing parity with where it is in world markets. And as a result, we've gone from about $3 to $4 a gigajoule of gas. At last year, at some stages, we were seeing $10 to $12 and higher, $14 a gigajoule for gas, which is an extremely high price to pay, particularly for large gas users in the manufacturing sector. But because we'd seen coal-fired power stations close, replaced with more intermittent sources of renewables, gas was also playing a greater role in the electricity sector as the marginal cost producer, the last bit of supply into the stack. And when gas prices are very high, this flows through to higher prices for consumers. And the other significant change, in addition to gas parity pricing, in addition to flatlining demand, in addition to a changing energy mix, in addition to more people going off the grid, is that now our energy system is no longer simply solving for a supply-demand equation. Now we're also solving for reducing emissions. And that is a very significant change to our domestic energy system. With some $80 trillion worth of assets in companies that are now in favour of climate-related disclosure, the fact that we are in a carbon-constrained environment is impacting on the financing decisions of companies that build generation assets. And so right now, our energy system is changing very dramatically as a result of factoring in emissions reduction in addition to just meeting a supply and a demand equation. Which brings me to the second lot of issues, which is what are we doing to deal with those rising power prices that are troubling consumers and are affecting our international competitiveness. Well, it's important when you look at the price of power to understand that there are lots of inputs into that supply chain. Networks, which are the poles and the wires, the distribution assets, tend to be around half the bill. In Australia, or a little bit less than half the bill. The wholesale generation costs tend to be around a third of the bill. Then you have in Australia retail costs, or the retailer which bundles together your bill, services the consumer, they're about 12% of the bill. And then the green schemes, both at a federal and a state level, the renewable energy targets, the feed-in tariffs, they're about 8% of the bill. And so we had to tackle each aspect of that supply chain in order to get prices down. So when it comes to networks, what we're trying to do is to deal with a regulated asset base which was built in the expectation of increasing demand that never eventuated. And so we have tried to reduce the exposure of consumers to increased network costs, even though the regulated asset base had increased. When it comes to the wholesale markets, the thing that we can do most to reduce power prices is to get more gas into the domestic market, because we've been exporting so much of our gas. So we created a gas security mechanism, which was quite a radical step in Australia, which meant that we could restrict exports if we saw a domestic shortfall in the gas market. Now, ultimately, the best answer to getting more gas into the domestic market is more supply. And the way to get more supply is to overcome some of these domestic concerns about unconventional gas extraction, which we all know is involved in the fracking debate. So we're trying to make the case for more unconventional and conventional onshore gas development, but this is a difficult one because of the regional concerns and local community concerns, and because state governments in Australia own the resources under the ground, which is quite different to other jurisdictions like in the United States, where it's the landowner and the farmer who owns the resources under the ground. But getting more gas into the domestic market has been a priority, and recently we were able to get an additional 70 petajoules into the domestic gas market, which has made a difference in bringing down prices. We've also tackled the pipelines and trying to, because we have a very concentrated market with pipelines, so we've tried to get more competition into the pipeline market, particularly around transparency, secondary trading, gas bulletin boards, getting a lot more transparency to what has really been bilateral, secret and long-term gas contracts between the pipeline operator and the consumer. So when it comes to the wholesale market, getting more gas into the market has helped us reduce prices. One of the other things that we're very conscious of now is not to allow coal-fired power stations to close prematurely. And it's an important lesson for other jurisdictions, because we saw in the state of South Australia, the northern coal-fired power station closed, was the only coal-fired power station closed in that particular state. And in Victoria, we saw the Hazelwood power station close, which was a 1,600 megawatt coal-fired power station representing about a quarter of that state's supply. In both instances, there was only a matter of months of notice before those particularly coal-fired power stations closed. And it was a real shock to the market with such little time to prepare for the withdrawal of such a large amount of capacity. We saw wholesale prices in those two state markets increase by more than 80%. So now we have put in a restriction that a large generator, and it doesn't matter if it's a thermal generator or if it's renewable, cannot close without a minimum of 3 years' notice. And in some states, there will even be longer periods of notice that have to be given. That way you can manage the transition a lot more easily. So we've got more gas into the market, we've tackled the pipelines, and we're no longer allowing some of the large-scale generators to close prematurely. The other thing that we're doing around price reductions is to get more storage into the market. We have a domestic renewable energy target, which is effectively a subsidy scheme to get more investment in renewables into the system. But one of the things that the renewable energy target did not take into account is that in certain jurisdictions there would be a heavy investment in intermittent sources of power without the necessary backup and storage. And again, South Australia was a case in point. On any one particular day, wind would generate 100% of that state's power, or could even be generating more than 100% of that state's power, so it could export it over the interconnector to other states. On other days when the wind was not blowing, and particularly they are hot days, it was generating 0% of that state's supply. And that creates a huge problem for pricing, because it leads to major volatility and it leads to the demand for either more gas, which is expensive, or to bring in coal-fired power over the interconnector. So we're investing in storage. Now, storage can take the form, as you know, of batteries, but it can also take the form in Australia of pumped hydro. And pumped hydro facilities are the most dominant form of storage for renewables around the world. And in Australia, we only have 3 pumped hydro facilities. But we've got a very large hydro project called the Snowy Hydro Project. And we are now expanding that to create a pumped hydro facility of 2,000 megawatts, which will be enough to power 500,000 homes, and that should be online by 2024. And the reason why that pumped hydro facility will be so important is it will create a big battery for the east coast of Australia. It will be the backup power that can be used to smooth out some of the volatility that you get from increases in intermittent sources of power into the system. So we've taken action on networks, we've taken action on the wholesale market, we've taken action on storage, and one other area where we've taken action is related to the retail offerings, because in many jurisdictions you will find that the retail companies will present their bills to the consumers, which will be increasingly complex and opaque, and the inertia in a customer moving between offers is very much the friend of the retailer but not the friend of the consumer. And so we've brought a lot more transparency to the bill offering to allow people to compare their offers more readily. And finally, the National Energy Guarantee. This is a very, very significant reform. And to understand how significant it is, you have to understand that one of the big drivers of the higher prices in Australia has been the uncertainty for investors because of a decade or more debate, unresolved, about emissions reduction and energy policy. So the Prime Minister, when he appointed me to this particular portfolio, for the first time brought energy and environment into the one portfolio. And the driver for that was because you can't reduce emissions in the electricity sector, which is about a third of Australia's overall emissions, without understanding the impact on the affordability and the reliability of power. Likewise, you can't strive to reduce prices and increase reliability without understanding the impact it will have on emissions in the electricity sector. Effectively two sides of the one coin. Now, the National Energy Guarantee was a recommendation to the federal government by our expert bodies. And what it consists of is two new obligations on the energy retailers. The first obligation is to provide a certain amount of dispatchable power into the system. And what I mean by dispatchable power is power that is available on demand regardless of the weather. Now, this can be thermal generation, coal or gas. It could be renewables with storage. It could be, to a smaller degree, demand-side response as well. But importantly, the energy market operator will assess the supply-the-demand balance that will be required and update their numbers year on year. And the retailers, commensurate with their overall share of any particular market, will have to provide a certain amount of dispatchable power to the system. So, for example, if you're energy retailer A and you have 50% of the market share in a particular jurisdiction, you will have to provide 50% of the dispatchable power that will be required by the market operator in that particular system. That will avoid the need, which has occurred most recently, of the energy market operator having to enter in the market to procure additional resources when they're afraid that the supply-demand balance has got particularly tight. The second obligation on the retailers is to reduce the emissions intensity of their portfolio of assets over time. So we have our target of a 26 to 28% reduction by 2030, and consistent with the trajectory to get to that target, every year the retailers will have to reduce the emissions intensity of their portfolio. Now, they can do so with the flexibility to decide what mix of generation assets they want. So retailer A may decide to have 1 coal-fired power station, 2 gas-fired power stations and 3 wind farms. Retailer B might decide to have 3 wind farms, 2 solar farms, no gas-fired power stations and 2 coal-fired power stations. And they will use the existing contract market to trade in order to provide that level of emissions intensity over time. It's not creating a trading scheme, it's not creating a new tax, it's not extending the subsidies which have distorted the market to date. It's using a regulatory mechanism to provide for a decrease in emissions intensity over time in the electricity sector, combined with this requirement to provide a certain amount of dispatchable power. Now, we've had economic modelling as to what would be the impact in the marketplace of these two new obligations on prices, and wholesale prices reduced by 23% per annum on average through that period. It's a very significant reduction in wholesale prices as a result of having the certainty in the electricity sector. And we also know that businesses and households will be much better off for no longer having this hyper-partisan debate about energy and climate policy in Australia. Of course, the emissions targets can change, but they will be set in legislation, and legislation requires an extended process to go through. It will also have the agreement of the states, which is another important part of this process, because having the states and the federal government on the same page for energy and climate policy is important too. So, Fatty, there's a lot that is happening in Australia's energy system. We're transforming it. We're undertaking significant reform, and we've also come up with this new model of a national energy guarantee. We're striving to get parliamentary support for it. It's a topical issue in Australia because, as it has been for a long time, but hopefully the policy can be landed, and as a result, more certainty can be brought to investors in the Australian market. And the final message I'd say is, as a result of a lot of these interventions and additional supply that's coming into the market, we've seen the wholesale price of power in Australia come down by around 25% in the first 6 months of this year compared to the same period last year. So there is a bit of a silver lining to what has been a pretty rocky road for a number of years. It is a very contested political space, but at the end of the day, if we can deliver more affordable and reliable power and meet our emissions reduction targets, then we'll be doing the consumers a great service. Thank you very much.
So, very impressive, Josh, both the concept, what you have done, how you have presented, and all of them without having one piece of paper. So I have, I think, more than 100 numbers you have quoted, and there is not one single piece of paper. So you are a minister of such a big country like ours, so you don't have a speechwriter, or you want to take this? You want to take this? Okay. So, Josh, if you are now 3 years as the minister, if you would, you have many achievements. We all know some of the numbers you have already presented. If you were to single out one biggest challenge in these 3 years, what would you say? What was the most important challenge you faced within the last 3 years as a minister?
I think it's trying to deconstruct the energy system so that the public can understand how complex it is, because people think it's simply, you get more prices if you simply build a new power station here or a new power station there, whereas the reality is it's a lot more complex than that. And there is no silver bullet to reducing power prices. There has been an overbuild on the networks, which we're paying for now because they are a regulated asset, so they're monopoly assets, and once they build, they can charge consumers consistently even if that asset is not being utilised. The retail offerings are very opaque, as I said, and consumers are unaware that they can save hundreds of dollars a year simply by changing retailer. We missed an opportunity to ensure more gas for our domestic market by expanding our exports, but without preparing for what was the black swan, which was states putting in place restrictions on the development of unconventional gas, which has really hurt us. And by having such short periods of notice for the closure of large coal-fired power stations, we weren't able to prepare satisfactorily for that gap in supply, which has sent wholesale prices increasing recently. So so the biggest challenge I have is trying to explain what is an extremely complex set of issues to the public. And when it comes to emissions reduction, you can never satisfy the extremes of the debate. I find that those on the right of this issue think that any effort, any investment to reduce emissions is $1 too much. And those on the left of this debate will never be satisfied whatever the size of the target you have, because their only goal is a decarbonised world. And so I feel, Fatty, that there are a lot of myths in this debate, and it's about trying to demystify some of those issues.
So I couldn't agree with you more, to be honest with you. We have, all of us, I think, here, different countries have similar challenges. So I would like to have this session is, George, I will ask a couple of the questions and then we will turn the floor. Now, I was last February visiting Australia, and we had very good meetings there. And when I met, of course, with you and several different stakeholders with different views in the energy sector, and there are views that I agreed, there are views that, of course, I had a different perspective. But all of them, or almost all of them, I have a big empathy, and I can understand where they come from. But there is one that I have difficult to understand, which I completely disagree, which is the banning of unconventional gas production. So Australia is a country with, in general, with the highest regulatory standards, strict regulations, and everywhere. And this is something that would make the people in that very state or states richer, much more prosperous, their schools, their hospitals, and everything, and bring a lot of money to the country. And this is something that I cannot understand, perhaps in line with what you have said. Yeah. People do not, perhaps we are not able to educate them in that respect. So can you tell us, do you see a light at the end of the tunnel? Sure. That we can see here some good news, I would say?
Well, not all states are the same. So Queensland is responsible for the vast majority, about 98% of the unconventional gas extraction in the country. So that's doing the heavy lifting, and a lot of the export is coming out of the Queensland fields. In the other states, I think the fault can be laid at the feet of not just some of the politicians, but also the manufacturing industries who do rely on cheaper gas to create jobs and to expand. They haven't made the case for this development as much as they should. Also, the situation is different in Australia compared to the United States, where the resource under the ground is actually owned by the state in Australia. And the landowner will get some royalties, but nothing like the size of the royalties an American landowner will get for developing their shale gas reserves. And so farmers who understandably want to protect their rich agricultural land are reluctant to have people come in and put in gas wells if they're only going to get tens of thousands of dollars as opposed to hundreds of thousands or more. So we are starting to overcome this issue, Fatty, by state governments recognising how important it is to develop more gas, and therefore giving more of their own royalty stream that the state governments get to the landowner, so sharing more of that. And that's providing more of a financial incentive. And I think the way forward for more gas development is through greater transparency around the methods that are used, about the type of equipment or the type of fluids that are used. And our chief scientist has done a bit of work around that and saying with the right practices, the public's confidence can be restored in what is involved in fracking of gas.
Thank you very much. Before going to the floor, another question from me. According to our numbers, in the next 5 years, Australia will be the leading coal exporter in the world. And how do you see in Asia and perhaps beyond the outlook for coal, for the possibilities for you to export more coal for electricity generation or for industry purposes?
Again, this has been quite a controversial domestic debate, and there's a particular mine called the Carmichael mine in Queensland where the coal would be going towards it, going to India, for example. And a lot of people say, well, why are you exporting coal if that's such a emissions or carbon intensive power source? Well, the reality is we're endowed with great resources, and if we don't export these resources to the world, then you can bet that other economies will fill that gap. And Australia's coal is low in sulphur and low in ash, so it's a cleaner form of coal. And coal is our second largest export behind iron ore, so it provides an important source of revenue, and both for the state and the federal government, and jobs in regional Australia. So I think our coal exports will continue. There is also a hot domestic debate in Australia about high efficiency, low emission coal-fired power stations. We already have 4 of these, but we don't have the ultra supercritical plants that you're seeing rolled out in Japan or parts of China or India. And in having this debate publicly, I say 2 things. One, let the market decide about some of these investments by creating a framework where investors can have certainty, and that's where the National Energy Guarantee can play a key role. But secondly, every country is different. So as you know, in Japan, after Fukushima, they've closed down a lot of their nuclear capacity and replaced it with Healy plants. And in China and India, they're also heavily investing in renewables as well.
In fact, is Mike here, Mike Waldron? No. He was telling me today that in Asia, still it's surprising for me, about 60% of the existing coal plants are still subcritical. Mm-hmm. It is really something to take note of. And the importance of Healy is definitely something
in terms of the national electricity market in Australia, today about 70% of our generation is coal, and under the National Energy Guarantee by 2030 it'll be around 60%. Now, you know the global average is around 38%. In the UK it's down to 10%. In the US it's just over 30% with a lot of coal, with a lot of gas. Germany it's a bit higher. So Australia has a high reliance on coal and will continue to do so, but there is a transition.
Okay, now let me turn to floor who would like to ask a question. Perhaps I start with Timo there.
Thank you, Mr. Minister, for the excellent speech. As you're talking about coal, I was wondering if you could give us an update on your view on carbon capture, utilization and storage. Is very important for our work, and presumably with the work or with the reliance on coal, it might be important for Australia as well. So maybe an update on what you're doing in this space would be much appreciated.
Well, I remember at the, I think it was in Marrakesh, or it was actually in one of the meetings that Ernie Moniz and myself and you and the Saudi minister and others were talking about CCSU, because carbon capture, storage and use. Look, we think that there is great value in CCS. We think that it hasn't been as developed globally as it should have been, And I think, Fatty, you've talked about how maybe the coal industry didn't push hard enough about the importance of CCS to maintain, for example, its industry long into the future. We have a organisation called the Clean Energy Finance Organisation, which is a $10 billion loan fund which provides low-cost finance for renewable and low-emission projects. We've been seeking to change the legislation to allow that fund to fund carbon capture and storage, but we've been opposed by the other major party in Australia, which is unfortunate because the IEA, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, our CSIRO, Chief Scientist, and others see CCS as an important, legitimate form of reducing emissions. We have a major project in Australia which has had some technical issues at the Gorgon gas plant off the west coast of Australia, which is looking to sequester a huge amount of carbon from there. I think what's exciting about CCS is not only does it apply to thermal generators, but it can apply to industry. So high emission intensive industries, a cement industry, for example, or a brick maker, or a plastics manufacturer, or a steel maker, if they can use CCS, that could also be quite effective for reducing emissions in industrial production. So as a country, we support it. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on various research projects. Those research projects are still underway, but we would want to commercialise it, but we need to change the legislation to allow that to happen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. I should tell you that our CCS work, we are pushing very strongly. CCS is run by our Australian colleague. Sam is here, and I'm sure she will talk with you after this meeting about our 28th of November. We organized with the UK Minister a major summit, and several ministers are coming. We are very much looking forward to have you here. And Sam, you talk with the Minister after that? Okay, thank you very much, to make sure that he's coming. Now, I go to Laszlo, followed by Simon. Laszlo?
First of all, thank you very much for joining us today. Now, there are countries in the world who are major gas exporters, and there are countries in the world where consumers have concerns about gas shortages. And Australia has this unique achievement to be both. And that creates a very interesting dilemma, because consumers have a very legitimate expectation that they don't want their supply disrupted by someone else developing an export business. Whereas at the same time, the oil and gas industry had very painful experience in other countries where governments were intervening in export contracts. And very often the oil and gas industry's approach is that I pay your royalty, then it's my gas, I want to take it wherever I want to take it. So I wonder, how do you resolve this dilemma of maintaining the investor confidence in the LNG industry while maintaining the supply for the domestic market? And the related question is that, what do you think about the initiatives of importing Austrian LNG into Australia?
Laszlo never asked one question,
That's
so you have
right,
two questions.
Well, the reality is Australia's had a fantastic, and continues to have, a fantastic reputation globally as a safe place to invest. When companies invest billions of dollars, they expect a return, and they know in Australia we have the rule of law, we have transparency in contracts, and we don't introduce sovereign risk. At the same time, we have an unacceptable situation where we were looking to have a shortfall in the domestic gas market on the east coast of Australia. So we set in place this mechanism, but that mechanism was never triggered. And the reason why it was never triggered was because we sat down with the large LNG exporters and reached a heads of agreement with the Prime Minister for them to provide more gas into the domestic market. Now, a lot of this was uncontracted gas that they would have otherwise sold into the spot market, which they could then sell into the domestic market. Now, when you're a big LNG supplier, you don't want to be troubled with small gas retailers in the domestic market. Even if you get a higher price on one particular contract or two, you're much better off just sending it to the place you know best, which is into the international spot market, and to offload it. That doesn't necessarily produce the best outcome for us here in Australia. So until we resolve the issue of getting more gas out of the ground, and by the way, we have 200 years worth of supplies in the Northern Territory, which to date had been locked up, and about 40 years worth of supplies in Victoria, which again continues to be locked up. So there is gas there in addition to what's being developed. We just need to get more of it out of the ground. In terms of LNG import terminals, well, again, the public are confused because they say, hang on, we've got all this gas, we export it everywhere, but you're telling me I have to potentially build an import terminal to get it from the west of Australia, or to get it, even dare I say it, from overseas. So while import terminals can set a ceiling on the price, because they basically cap the price because, you know, in the case of Australia, you'll probably cap the price at about $10 a gigajoule, they don't necessarily drive down the price. And what we need to get to, and we're starting to get to it now, is what it's called the netback price, the LNG netback price. That's what we're striving for. It's the cost of getting the gas out of the ground, you know, minus whatever the cost to transport it is to Tokyo. If we can get to the LNG netback price, then I think that will be good for the domestic market, and that's where we're getting.
Thank you very much. Now I go to Simon. You mentioned, Mr. Minister, the Finkel review, and when there was this South Australian the blackout, he made this review, and Simon was one of the colleagues who supported the Finkel review. Simon?
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very interesting to hear this comprehensive analysis of the current issues going on in Australia, especially after having worked on it quite a bit. And I do have a question on system integration. I think you mentioned a number of measures that have been taken on the wholesale level for the larger system. And I think really there has been a huge progress made over a short period of time. My question goes to the small scale issue, so the rooftop PV. I think Australia might be the first country in the world where distributed rooftop PV might supply an entire state, 100% of the demand during a few hours in just a few years from now. Now, this is a radical change in how you operate a power system, the system operator, even knowing what's generating, having control over these resources. So what are the steps you're taking to look into this and address this potentially quite soon arriving challenge?
Well, one of the priorities for us is to get more household storage. So the chief scientist, Alan Finkel, actually produced a report last week, Fatty, where he said Australia has now had not only record solar PV, but record number of household batteries that have been installed. And at the Commonwealth level, we've also been funding what we call virtual power plants, where we link up thousands of homes with solar PV and batteries, and that they group their excess power generation at any particular time and send it into the grid or move it between households as need be. So we're looking at a whole series of innovative ways to deal with that. As I referred to in my comments, one of the big issues is around network costs, because if you're only using the network from 5:30 p.m. till 8 in the morning, but that is the time of peak demand, so you have to actually build out the network to deal with those peak demands. Should you be paying just as much as the person who rents an apartment on a low income but cannot afford solar PV during the day and has to use the network all through the day? So there are real equity issues here, and it's a debate in Australia around what we call cost-reflective tariffs. You probably call them elsewhere cost-reflective tariffs. Is who's going to be paying for that? So the energy market operator is very focused on the challenges that are being created for the supply-demand balance by the rapid uptake of solar panels. And in the short term, one of the things we're going to need to do is to get more storage in there.
Thank you. Before going to Mr. Sadamani, we are bombarding you with a lot of questions, Mr. Minister. Just let me ask you a completely different question. I know that you were a semi-professional tennis player, and they played.
I eat for a living now.
Yes,
yeah.
I saw several news. Amos Bromhead, my chief of staff, the IES chief of staff, showed me those articles. So, do you see? I mean, you went to many competitions and very competitive work there, sport. Any similarities between the Minister of Energy and being a professional tennis player?
Well, in the case of tennis, my ambitions were far greater than my talents. I'm hoping in politics it's not the same.
Excellent.
But the reality is, anybody in sport who tries, to make it good, whether it's in soccer or tennis or any other sport, one of the things that they learn, which is a great life lesson, is to treat triumph and disaster, and treat those two imposters just the same. As a famous poem, "If" by Rudyard Kipling, which is true. Like, you have to, you have a success one day, and the next day you lose. It's not the end of the world, right? And it's just about bouncing back. The discipline of preparing for big matches, big tournaments is great, but it's how you handle success and failure, which is a really good life lesson.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, I will go to Mr. Sadamari, who is the Director for Energy Markets.
Thank you very much for the very well-organized, comprehensive speech. I'm really impressed. And I'm in charge of energy markets and security at the IEA. And of course, energy security includes the electricity security, which you talked about. And that was a very interesting one. And I think that the energy guarantee systems introduced by Australia can be a very good model for other countries who is serious about ensuring the electricity security. But here, I think I would like to ask another type of energy security, which is about the oil security. And you know that the IEA has the emergency response systems and the emerging stock deobligations. And I really appreciate the Australian efforts in recent years in trying to come up with the kind of the compliance with the IEA obligations by deciding to purchase tickets. And actually, there are a lot of efforts going on. We really appreciate it. So I wonder if, I would appreciate if you could elaborate more on your recent efforts in terms of the liquid fuel supply security. We are very much interested in this project. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So Australia's been in non-compliance since 2012. We have about 54 days worth of supply as opposed to the 90-day holding. But on any given day, there are 45 oil tankers en route to Australia with about 20 days worth of supply. We have seen in the last decade three refiners close in Australia. And one of the reasons why they've closed is because they get economies of scale in Asia. Some of the big refiners in India, for example, are huge now. And so it's just become an economic question. So we're down to 4 refineries in Australia, and we import more than 50% of our refined crude from more than 20 different countries, but no single country has more than 20% of their exports to Australia. So it's got to the point where I'm starting to think, even though we haven't had a disruption to our energy supply for 4 decades in Australia since the OPEC crisis, we haven't had a disruption. I'm starting to think, and the government, the Prime Minister, we're all thinking about liquid fuel security. Now, liquid fuel security, as you know, is petrol, diesel, and aviation fuel. Now, that makes up about 98% of our transport energy needs, and it's about 38% of our overall energy needs. So we are looking at our level of stocks and what we need to maybe enhance them. And so that bit of advice is currently underway. It's very expensive to build new storage facilities and to require companies to hold it. We're also seeing a transformation in the electric vehicles that will come. So that may change the use of transport fuels over time if you think long term. So there are a lot of different components to this. On the ticketing arrangements, we have 5 bilateral agreements now. The United States, the UK, Germany, the Netherlands and Denmark. And so we've got those arrangements in place, which is a good thing, but obviously we want to get back to full compliance. And now we have about 52, 53 days worth of supply, and the idea is to get back to compliance in the years ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. This makes us very happy, you being so determined to go back to full compliance. Now I go to Bruce Murphy.
You know everyone here, Fatty.
Yes, Bruce is also Australian, another Australian.
Okay,
exactly.
Thank you for your time, Minister. And the other thing we have in common is our shared love for the Carlton football side.
Right.
And it was interesting to hear the life lessons from sports. So we've lost 13 of our first 14 games. Is there an end soon to the life lessons?
Well, Bruce, what I say about Carlton is we're 10 years into our 5-year redevelopment plan.
Switching to more positive topics, though. Before joining the IEA, it was the Resources and Energy Councillor for the Australian Government based in New Delhi, and it was very encouraging to hear your thoughts and your support for the opening of the doors of the IEA policy. So an open question really, why do you think it's important to have voices like India in the preeminent energy agency that the IEA is?
Well, we're back in the early 70s, the OECD countries were it. But now, power on the international stage and economic power is much more distributed, to use an energy phrase. And these countries should be at the top table as we map out the future energy needs and future energy policy for the world. So you need to have China, you need to have India, you need to have Indonesia there, welcoming in Mexico. All those changes that you've had underway, I think, are very significant, in addition to the traditional OECD countries. So it's about being more representative as an organisation of the economic and energy realities that we're now seeing in the world. I mean, when you look at your world energy outlook, I mean, China is the dominant player in terms of demand forecasts, some of the technology developments, and you just have to factor in what that means for global energy markets, and India, of course.
As I said in the beginning, I am really thankful to you for all the support we have received in terms of, as Bruce said, opening the doors. Looking at so many Australians in the IEA, Mr. Minister, I asked our HR colleague, Greg, here, to look at the distribution of
you must be paying him a lot or something.
He gets a lot of money, definitely. To check how many the distribution of the nationalities within the IEA. So in terms of absolute values, Australia is number 4. In terms of the country's contribution to IEA budget versus the representation of the nationalities, Australia is number one, by far. So how can we explain this? Why Australians are so good represented in the IEA? Do you have, from outside, do you have any possible explanation?
It's a currency issue.
Okay, an excellent answer. So we have a question from Mexico, and then followed by Laura. And I think, Rebecca, we are coming to an end because I have 2 final questions. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your interesting speech. Related with the comments in the natural gas, the shale gas in Australia, what kind of the comments or recommendations you can provide to the Mexico? Because we have a lot of resources, unconventional resources in Mexico. We are trying to identify the best strategies to develop these resources. But at the same time, we have some social and environmental aspects that are involved in order to develop the resources. On the other hand, we are importing a lot of gas from the US. It's another aspect related with the energy security. Another aspect is the concern related with the price. How we can combine all of these aspects in order to develop these unconventional resources. One is energy security, environmental aspects, social aspects, and the right price to develop the resources. The equation is a little bit complex in order to develop these resources. What are the recommendations you can provide us for this new government now they are coming in my country? Thank you.
Well, I think you start from the premise that economic development and environment sustainability are not mutually exclusive. This is the challenging issue with the portfolio of the environment, is that it's not all or nothing. You can have economic development and you can have good environmental practices. And nowhere is that better seen than in some of the debates around resource extraction. And I think it's incumbent upon governments and, as I said before, large users of energy to make that public case. The best antidote to the public's criticism is transparency. And so all the practices should be transparent. You can put in place an effective regulator, and with new technologies, you can have open source data and give people access to that. So there are a lot of things you can do to install confidence in the system. In Australia, because the states own the resource, one of the things we've done at the federal level is we've used a group called Geoscience Australia, which is the official geological body, to map out the resource. And by us paying for the mapping out of the resources, we then present it to the state governments and say, look what you can develop here. So they don't have to get to base one by themselves. We can get them to base one, which is to know where to look and to know how much they have. Then they can stake the next couple of bases by actually building the economic case, funding the processes, putting the right regulatory regime in place.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. So last question, I go to Lara. Lara is in charge of all our modeling efforts. Yeah.
So, Mr. Minister, thank you very much. Incredibly interesting presentation. We are in the World Energy Outlook this year having a focus on electricity, and we were fortunate enough to have Drew Clark actually chairing one of the sessions at the electricity workshop. And we just finished writing a spotlight on your virtual power plant, so to make it a big showcase for all member countries. Now,
she's going to ask for a voluntary contribution now.
The big question for you is the following. You described perfectly the triple attack that we are seeing in many IEA countries to the electricity sector. First, flatlining energy demand. Second, increasing share of variable renewables, wind and solar. Third, many countries phasing out coal and nuclear. Now, we have to write recommendations for our IEA member countries. If you had two recommendations to give, one, the thing to do, and the second, the thing not to do, what would be the first recommendations that you would like to see in the World Energy Outlook?
Well, the first thing I think you need to do with more intermittent sources of power is to get more storage, because otherwise you get major volatility in price, and you can also run short at times of peak demand, because when it gets really hot, the wind doesn't tend to blow. And the experience in Australia is that peak demand at 5:30, 6 o'clock, 6:30 at night is when the sun started to go down. So unless you've actually stored the power, or you have the pumped hydro facility to come on, you can be caught out. Well, there's a lot of things not to do based on Australia. Obviously, and I think I alluded to this, which is don't allow the thermal generators to close without understanding what that impact is on the wholesale price or on the reliability of the system. Something I didn't talk about in my speech, which is important, is the ancillary services, the frequency control and ancillary services, otherwise known as FCAS and inertia, because they come from synchronous forms of generation, spinning turbines, which is coal, gas and hydro, but it's not wind and solar. So we're doing in Australia some really innovative things, Fatty. We're actually trying to now generate our own FCAS from wind farms. And so there's some really interesting things we're doing, but you need things what are called synchronous condensers, and you need some of these in the system to provide those security and stability services, because energy security is different to energy stability. Energy stability is the reliability component. Energy security is around, the voltage, frequencies and so forth. So I would say that is something you really need to do. And then the last thing I just make, and it's not a point I stressed in the speech, but it is absolutely essential to what's happening. And you've made this point, Fatty, which is the declining cost curve for renewables. People get focused on emissions reduction and forcing new generation into the system, which, by the way, can be quite problematic, as we've found, because it can lead to distortions of investment decisions. And if you have out-of-the-market subsidies, which is what our renewable energy scheme was, it was a subsidy outside the initial market, so it was being provided, is that people focus on emissions, but what is really driving more renewable investment now is actually the declining cost curve. And we're seeing PPAs being signed in Australia for renewables at $60, right, a megawatt hour, which is very competitive, right? Now, $60 a megawatt hour is not firm power. It's not, what gas or coal can necessarily be, but it's very cost-effective power once it's dispatched. And as you know, wind and solar have pretty much zero marginal cost. So the levelised cost of energy is still up there, is still high, or not as high as gas, but high. But the marginal cost of these forms of intermittent sources of power is zero, and that's what's going to be driving a lot more of new investment.
Thank you very much for answering all these questions, Mr. Minister. I know there are some colleagues who still want to ask questions, and perhaps at the reception here they can approach you. What I like in this big ideas, not only learning from the great people like you, Mr. Minister, but I am the one who asked the questions for a change, so I don't need to answer all these questions, but thank you very much for that. I have one final question. It's perhaps the most important. Who's
going to win the World Cup?
How did you know? So, but perhaps Amos already told you. So, but I want to warn you that we have the Brazilian ambassador here among other ambassadors. So, which is my favorite.
I take back my comment about Neymar then.
So, really, I mean, you are a sportsman. You follow all the matches as much as you can. Who do you think who will get the World Cup?
Well, so far, I mean, the Russians have been surprising, haven't they?
Yes.
I know. I'm not making a moral comment on anyone. Hometown. Remember South Korea? Remember they tend to do well.
Yes.
The hometown teams. I mean, look, much smarter people than me, or astute observers like you, tend to look at France and Brazil as the two major contenders. So I'll probably stick with them. Although, isn't it interesting that Italy missed out? America,
even
Turkey. Turkey missed out. The Netherlands missed out. The United States missed out.
Exactly.
But we were there, so we were happy about that.
Okay, thank you very much. And this is all registered, of course. Thank you. So, Mr. Minister, I thank you very much for coming here. And there are many ambassadors here, experts, and IEA colleagues. You said I know many of them. Is I know almost all of them, and I know something that they all want from you. They didn't tell me, but I feel, which is the following. So we are, or put it this way, you are our landlord in fact. So we are now in a preliminary building. We are soon going to go back to this embassy, very soon. And we would like to come back home as soon as possible. And we have some challenges in Canberra here and there. So we would be grateful if you can help all these colleagues and me to go back as soon as possible. I wanted to mention to you as a prelude to our bilateral meeting upstairs in front of the colleagues here.
But got the ambassador onto it.
But dear colleagues, please do join me to thank Minister Frydenberg, in my view, one of the most successful energy ministers in the world now. Mr. Minister, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.